Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, and I'm your host today, joined by Cody, Beau, Tracy in studio. We've got Karen sitting next to me. We've got Matt producing. Cody, what is our topic today?
More disruptive than we thought.
That's right. More disruptive than we thought means that this idea of our working genius as being disruptive versus responsive is actually more important and has a greater impact than even we realized. Because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I'm disruptive, or I'm a double disruptive, or I'm a double responsive. But this is actually a bigger deal than we realized, and there's still a lot of room for misunderstanding and frustration if we don't completely understand and internalize this. And I think the first thing we should do is probably remind people what this means. So if you're a W, wonder, or a discerner, D, or enablement, E, WDE, the 3 across the top of the 6, those are what we call responsive geniuses, which means you're actually responding to an external stimulation and doing what you do. Okay. The ones on the bottom, which would be invention, galvanizing, and tenacity, we call disruptive because that's like initiating a change, a new idea, or getting people to change what they're doing, to rally them, or tenacity, blowing through an obstacle. And you're actually provoking a change on the environment around you. So a responsive person versus a disruptive person. And this has a real impact on how we work together and how we interact with one another. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
It's interesting, on this episode, we have 2 people who are double. Tracy is double responsive. I am double disruptive. And then 2 people who have kind of one of each. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. Part of where this topic came from is I just spent 3 days at a conference talking to people about working genius, which is part of why my voice sounds tired. And the aha that people have when they learn about their responsiveness or disruption, it feels like it just clarified for them some of how people have experienced them their whole life. This was true for me. When I first took the assessment, the first 2 times I took the assessment, it was really early on. I tested as an ID. And then when Cody, I think, explained disruptive to me, I'm like, nope, that's 100% me. And it pains me a little bit because disruption is not always what people want, but it is what I naturally do. It's the magnets to how I'm drawn. And Tracy, you're double responsive. I'm curious, how was that for you, discovering that you had 2 responsive geniuses?
Well, it was not surprising. Let's just say that. And it was relieving to me because I thought, oh, what's wrong with me? Why isn't that I can't, shake the trees, take the bull by the horns? It's just not in my DNA. So it definitely was one of those things that provided some relief.
Yeah. And Tracy, I remember, so we came up with Working Genius. And like we like to say, we didn't invent it. We discovered it because this is something that we just think is true. And so we saw these 6 things. And I remember afterward going, wait a second, those 3 right there are very different than these 3 down here. And again, I don't recall where that came from. I mean, thank you, God, for all of it. But we realize there's a real difference between how people in those top 3 go about interacting with the world around them and the people in the bottom 3.
In fact, Pat, I think that was one of our first breakthroughs, was the way we split, the responsive, disruptive, and then the 3 stages of work.
Right.
That's something that we discovered sort of right out of the gate because it was clear to us.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. I think back to the conversations we had as we were sort of formulating this whole theory around working genius, which is we didn't even arrive at the words responsive and disruptive for a long time. We were observing the behavior of people that had these geniuses. And I think like there were iterations of this where we were like, is it that there's a fast genius and a slow, there's a fits
steady.
and starts or leaning in and leaning back. And so we finally arrived on the responsive and disruptive language. And I actually feel like that is the best articulation of how you experience people with those geniuses, because it's not that they care less. It's not that it's slower. It's so much a part. All of this is necessary. We talk about every job being a 6-letter job, but the way someone shows up, if they're a double responsive, if they have 2 responsive geniuses versus 2 disruptive geniuses, is really observable. and
Yes.
really important for us to remember when we're working with them, managing them, or engaged in relationships with them at all.
Absolutely. And we go back to the original intent of this is to reduce unnecessary or unfair guilt and judgment. And the thing about this is when you don't realize that you're double responsive or double disruptive, or even one or the other, but especially if you're double, you're going to feel guilty. Both sides feel guilty. The person that's double responsive feels like guilty, like, why am I not getting in there and grabbing the bull by the horns? The person who's double disruptive thinks, why do I have to be a jerk to make things happen? And neither of those is true. It's like you're wired to disrupt and grab the bull by the horns. You're not wired to do that. And if you realize that, then you can let go of the guilt and go, yeah, that's not my thing. And if I do have to do it, I'm really, it's a free will gift to people to go outside of my comfort zone to do that. The judgment part isn't, Cody, you told a great story about a guy you were working with recently who didn't have disruptive in his genius. And it's easy to go, God, I thought that guy cared more.
Yeah, even specifically, like this language helped me free myself of some judgment from day one all the way through to last week, where because I had galvanizing, I always thought galvanizing is my only disruptive genius. So I'm willing to get in front of the room and rally people to have the conversation. And I interpret that on my own behalf as passion for what we're doing. And so then when somebody like even Tracy early on, I'm like, why doesn't Tracy do that? And then learning that she's a double responsive, I had previously assigned someone being double responsive as being like less passionate about what we're doing, which was like such a great thing for me to be aware of and overcome, because I still to this day need to remind myself going into team conversations about people's geniuses and how they show up, because otherwise I will make those same judgments, misapplications again.
Yeah, I'm the same, Cody. If I often say that initiative is my love language. And so I perceive disruption as initiative, even though there can be initiative that's happening in a more responsive way. In fact, at this conference, we had this happen, that a couple amazing teammates were helping to do everything behind the scenes. And then we got there and needed kind of a last 10% push. And it's so easy to internalize, why aren't they pushing, driving, owning? Why aren't they standing up for this? Well, they did a whole lot behind the scenes that looked different than it would look as a disruptor doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's so, I just think about this. It's like when the internet came out, I remember some guy came to talk to us when I was at a company and said, the internet is going to be huge. And I remember, dude, we already know that. But then what he was saying is, no, I know you already know it, but it's going to be bigger than you thought. And disruptive and it's easier for people to respond to. Go, yeah, I know it. Now, but I think what we're saying here is, no, it's bigger. It's more difficult and more important than we realized. And I just had a realization as I was listening to you, Beau, and that is that I am pretty clear now that I prefer discernment over invention. And we've always said that's not necessarily true, but I don't like to disrupt. Maybe it's because of wounds, or maybe it's other things in life. But when I have to use my I in a disruptive way, purely I actually feel really guilty, and I don't like to do it. I love when people come and ask my opinion about something, like they ask me a question, which they're asking for my discernment. That is like, yeah, I feel like so relieved. But when I have to go stand up in front of everybody and go, come on, you guys, I think here's a new idea. Let me explain it to you. I actually prefer to be responsive than disruptive. And I have a guiltiness about having to disrupt. Now, maybe all people that disrupt have some of that. Maybe it's because society says, oh, you should never actually push people out of their comfort zones. But whatever it is, I think disruption carries with it a lot of angst.
I think there's so many people that probably feel the exact same way that you described, Pat, where even people with tenacity are like, boy, I'm always the one that has to push us over the finish line. And I feel bad because most everybody wants to move on, or someone with, galvanizing, like I always have to be the one that initiates the conversation. So, but I easily, yeah, as you were saying that too, Pat, I thought one of the observations I have, so we've talked about this on an individual level, there's a very real element to this around the culture of a whole team too. So like when you think of the disruptive nature of the team or the responsive nature of the team, you can feel guilty on either side of that. So I'm a DG, and in where I get to use my discernment, is great. But in our culture, we love my galvanizing because we have less disruption. Well, I was just in a meeting where the primary letter is galvanizing, G, and I felt so bad for using discernment because they were all, yeah, let's do this. It's going to be great. And I felt guilty for being the only person that was slowing the train down and wanting to, so it is sort of interesting the context of when you're using it.
Yes. And if you're in the minority and you're pushing against the grain, because like Tracy was asking me before we did this, like, so which of yours do you think, we were wondering if people gravitate toward the disruptive, because that's the one that's easier to notice. But like I said, I don't disrupt when I'm with a bunch of people that are disrupting because I realize, oh, they're doing that work. I don't have to. I can sit back and use my discernment. But if I'm in a room where everybody's responsive, then I'm like, oh, I guess I have to disrupt this a little bit, and then I'll start to go to my eye. But I prefer not to have to do that.
Yeah, and Pat, when you're the lone disruptor, that's when the angst sets in. That's where it's really lonely for you. I mean, years of our company, you were the lone disruptor.
Wow, you're right.
Years. Yeah,
that's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and our team that comes up with new ideas, there's 4 of us, and there's 3 double responsive, and then and so yeah, that makes sense. That's really interesting, and which is fun because when Beau comes out to play and he's an IG, a double disruptive, I'm like, oh, this is a party. He's going to push this ball, and I'll just get to steer it a little bit, So it's fun. It's a really interesting thing.
And somewhere when we said it's more disruptive than we thought, it's this dynamic of responsive disruption is always happening. It's always happening. Even if you're at the type of work, let's say you're doing creative dreaming work, you're doing ideation. Even if W and I are not in your geniuses, you are watching this play between responsive and disruption that is happening. And as a leader, we need to attend to that. I did a bad job for a long time attending to when is disruption needed and when do I need to actually let there be space and pause and actually do a little bit more, white space kind of time, if that makes sense. So it's always happening. I talked to a WE this week, and just imagine what it's like on a team if there's somebody who isn't wondering and if there isn't somebody who's enabling. But that person is always going to have a harder time advocating for themselves, standing up, speaking out, pushing, driving. And so part of, I feel like our role as a leader is to orchestrate that to make sure we're giving space for both the responsive and disruptive.
Yeah. In addition to space, and I didn't mean to make a rhyme here, but I think there's grace. Because think of like a person who's a GT cannot help themselves by seeing something that's not being done and telling people about it and getting them to finish. And I tell you, I know GTs and they're like, oh, I know I'm such a pain in the ass. And it's like, no, you're not. But in our society, when you're doing that all the time, you can start to see yourself as a pain in the ass. Whereas somebody else is like, I'm a WE, which I would say is the most responsive of all the combos. And they're like, oh, and people don't appreciate or notice me. And it's like, I don't know, what am I doing wrong? It's like, no. That's how you contribute. And you don't need to take the blame on for that. The more grace we can give people and meet them where they're at, thank people for being a GT, thank people for being a WE, whatever you are. We need to, this sounds like a kindergarten teacher talking, but it's really true. We need to help people understand themselves better so they can let go of the guilt and judgment and then be what they're meant to be.
Yeah, and I love something Beau said before we started recording is, as people are hearing this, they're like, oh man, I'm double disruptive. Maybe I should cool it a little. Maybe I should regulate my own geniuses, or the person who's double responsive might be thinking like, well, I'll just exert myself a little bit more. And the truth is this is the beauty of working geniuses. You should just be self-aware. That's the right thing is know that that's the way you're wired. And then be more of who you are. And then look to other people to fill in the gaps. Like this is not hey, let's equally all be as medium disruptive or as medium responsive as possible. That's not the solution. The solution is, hey, embrace the way that you're wired, the way that God wired you, and then live into that, and then look for other people to help you fill in the gaps.
And the guilt makes us less likely to call out our deficiencies. And when I say deficiencies, not mean like a bad thing. I mean like our our limitations. We all have limitations. And Tracy and I are going through something right now where we have this project we're working on. And I'm constantly feeling like, oh, are we pushing hard enough? And she's like, what are you saying? Do you think I don't care enough? And it's like, no, I'm not saying that, but I wonder if we can push harder. And we're missing each other because it feels like we're saying you're not enough, or we're questioning one another's competence. But actually what it is I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I'm wondering if we're being disruptive enough. And she probably feels like I'm criticizing her, which I'm not, because, and I could be wrong. Maybe I don't, maybe it doesn't need to be more disruptive, but since I bring that disruption to the table, we both need to go, oh, wow, you want to disrupt this situation more. I don't necessarily like doing that more. What's the situation call for? Not which of us should just, it's like, it's not about judging one another. It's about, what is the right approach in this situation? Should we lean more on your disruption? Should we lean more on my responsiveness? And that then it becomes just a strategic decision as opposed to a character flaw. I don't know if that makes any sense. Does that make sense, Tracy?
Yeah, it sort of takes the emotion out of it.
Right.
It makes it more objective.
Right.
Yeah.
And wow, and that is the first step in solving problems, is getting the emotion out of it when it's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. I was talking to another leader this week, Eric. If Eric listens to the podcast, you're the man. And he was talking about, he's an inventor galvanizer, and he was asking for some feedback. I watched him do a presentation, and I could tell he was looking for feedback of how to improve some of his weaknesses. I just thought, Eric, your team needs your passionate ideas. Keep bringing your passionate ideas. And it's amazing, like, there's nobody else on your team who can probably do that. The way you're leading your team has the potential to change your organization and make people's jobs better. And then you need the insightful collaborator, the discernment enablement alongside of you. And to be able to call that out, people will actually love it more rather than being irritated by it coming at the wrong times, when they say that you need the other folks around you to then help make those ideas refined and get started and happen.
Yeah. Celebrate who you are, and celebrate the fact that other people are good at things you suck at, because we all suck at stuff, and that's all right. God made us that way. So one of the reasons why this can be hard, and Karen was just reminding me of this, is that when there's the introvert extrovert thing, which if you know Myers-Briggs, you know what that means. But even if you don't, you kind of know introverts tend to get their energy from being on by themselves, and they think inside their own mind. Extroverts tend to think out loud, and they get their energy from being other people. So it's for being around others. It's easy to assume that an extrovert is going to be disruptive. Mm-hmm. And so, like Cody, in your example, the guy you were talking about is an extrovert. So you were like, of course he's going to disrupt when necessary. He's not afraid to speak his mind. But because his working genius is double responsive, he is not going to do that in the same way. Versus there's an introvert over there who doesn't speak very much, but if they are a disruptor, they're going to see something and go, okay, I'm going to step in now and make this happen. So when we assume that a person, because they're an introvert or an extrovert or any other kind of profile, is a certain way, we have a real potential for frustrating them and ourselves.
Totally. I even think what this does for me, Matt's on the recording, but I remember when I was managing Matt, and I thought, like, working genius for me is like looking at a person and realizing, oh, I could tap into those gifts. But if you're double responsive, I might have to prompt them,
Yeah.
Whereas Beau is kind of offering his gifts, as a disruptor. He's more inclined to just say, here they are. You have to deal with them whether you want to or not. Sometimes you have to tap into the wonder, discernment, enablement gift.
Right, because Matt, just to be clear, Matt's a WD, a double responsive. Beau is an IG, a double disruptive. And I like to say this because I say it about myself too. And I'm an extrovert. Matt's an introvert. Beau's an extrovert. So that does pile on top of that. It doesn't make it. But Beau and I are going to come up with 10 ideas, and your job is to help us pour through them and find the 3 that are worth doing. Matt is going to come up with 10 ideas, and our job is to ask him, so he'll tell us 3 of them.
Yeah.
That will probably work. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so in knowing that, instead of going like, why don't you do that? It's like, we're like, oh, I know why you do that. Let me adjust the way I work with you. And that is really what this is about. It's like actually seeing somebody for the person God made them to be, so we can honor them and adjust our behaviors and our expectations in a way that makes everybody feel heard, seen, and valued. And that is what this episode is about. Disruptive more than we thought, disruptive and responsive. Hey, thanks. This podcast is growing like crazy, which we love. And so is Working Genius. And we appreciate everybody that listens. We love talking about this. We love meeting you out there and talking about your Working Genius and knowing the ahas you're experiencing. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you for sharing it with others because you're changing people's lives. And we love helping you do that. All right. We'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius podcast, everybody. God bless.